for people listening, I guess if they're not used to the idea of kind of how sound relates to flavor in some way, what made you think that could be a possibility? What was it about sound and spiciness, or sound and taste or flavor in the first place, that kind of put you on that track?
Well, I think, when we talk a lot about this idea of cross-modalism, the idea that all of our senses work together, and certainly that's part of Charles's work is understanding what the relationships are, and if we understand those, can we hack our sensory perception? In our case, how could we use sound to affect our other senses? And so when you think about some of these cross-modal associations, many of them are very natural. So we can think about music in terms of arousal. If you think about, working with you were listening to a band and you said, man, that band is hot. It's like, well, in some ways that vernacular means that, they may be the latest thing out there that everybody's listening to. But it could also have to do with that level of excitement, the intensity that they bring to that experience. And so we think about heat, we think about sound, and it becomes very natural associations when you start thinking about flavor. And so that was the start of it for me. And also, as I said, we kind of looked at the research and found that there'd been a lot of research around sweetness, bitterness, maybe, umami, but not as much around this idea of heat.
And for people who aren't familiar with, let's say, the research in that area, what
Sure.
has it shown? What is it about sweet and salty and bitter and sour and
Sure.
umami that relates to sound, or how do they relate to sound?
Well, there's, we call them the sonic seasonings, if you will. How do we tease those out? So the experimental methodology very often begins simply with looking at what are the sonic building blocks, like pitch, tempo, consonance, dissonance, attack, decay. These are all things that we have control over as we develop a piece of music or sound.
Mm-hmm.
And we begin by working with an experimental model where we play different varieties of sound and have people just make subjective associations with them.
Okay.
Does that sound spicy? And again, because some of these are very natural, these associations start, and we're just looking for high degrees of significant correlations between certain sounds and flavor associations. Then once we have those, we take those ingredients, and then the next step is, okay, can we put these together in a way where now we can run an experiment to see what the actual impact is? And so without going through all the myriad of details around that, what we found in the outcomes ultimately was that using the sonic ingredients for spiciness, which we found were faster tempo, higher pitches, a little bit of a distortion, fast attack, fast decay, and unsurprisingly, maybe a little bit of a cultural cue. Like instead of a steady, like an indigenous North American Indian beat, maybe you would need something that might be more like a Brazilian samba or a salsa. And these cultural cues kind of help, prime our brain. So we put all of these together into a piece of music, tested it, and what we found was that when people were eating something that had some level of heat to it, some spiciness, the brain seemed to be primed by listening to our spicy soundtrack to have an expectation that what you're eating is going to be spicy. And this is where it gets really interesting, because we found that if the food is indeed spicy, this spicy soundtrack is actually magnifying that experience. So The food's spicy, I taste it listening to the soundtrack and my brain says, wow, that's really spicy. So if you were to ask somebody, how spicy something was when they weren't listening to the soundtrack, they would say, oh, that's spicy. Somebody listening to the spicy soundtrack would say, wow, that's really spicy. But if it's only mildly spicy, it starts working the other way. Our brain is saying, you should be tasting something that's really spicy. Oh, is this really all that spicy? I don't think so. And so somebody who's tasting something that's mildly spicy, they would probably rate that as tasting a little spicier than somebody who's listening to the spicy soundtrack whose brain is getting confused because they're expecting it to be much spicier than it's registering. And I think what this teaches us in general is, and this as you prepare your meals, you're looking at congruence and incongruence. So, either magnifying an experience by putting together all these congruent multisensory aspects of things, or perhaps shocking the system momentarily with something that isn't expected, something that's incongruent. And the thing that we have to be careful with is that typically incongruence is not a pleasant experience. And so while we might want to have a moment where we shock our system, we don't want that moment to continue on for very long without kind of bringing us to a place of congruence, or else we will tend to feel really uncomfortable. We'll tend to avoid it. It won't be a pleasant experience. And, you do that too often in your restaurant, you're not going to have customers coming back because, they're not ultimately going to enjoy that experience.